The question I'm going to ask today, Dad, Papa, is...
The question that we're going to talk about is...
What is the most scared I've ever been? That one leapt off the page for me.
What was my first big trip?
How was the day of your wedding?
I'm going to talk about how I almost died twice in 2 years.
She was telling me her life story, and she didn't know it was me.
That is an absolutely true story.
And I can tell you about it.
Hi, welcome to the Storyworth Podcast. I'm your host, Krista Baum. If you're new to Storyworth, we help people write their life stories, the big stories and the small ones. Here's how it works. If you sign up for Storyworth, we email you or someone you invite a question every week. We ask questions that evoke memories. Things like, what were you like as a teenager? Or, what do you remember from the day JFK was shot? You reply to the email, attach a photo if you want, and after you're finished, we make a hardbound book for you. The chapters of the book are filled with life stories, and it's a beautiful way to capture a person's memories. Today on the podcast, the story of Carol Paige, a woman who wrote her life story with Storyworth. One of the chapters is called My Winter Romance, and it's about falling in love later in life. Now, before you listen, Carol has something called ataxia, which affects motor skills and her voice. All of that is to say you might want to listen to this episode in a quiet place.
Okay. My name is Carol Paige, and I got remarried late in life after my spouse died. And I decided to write a story about it called My Winter Romance. I think people think that you can't have a winter romance. And I wasn't looking to get remarried at all. I knew him for a long, long time and just haven't. I have 4 plates I used to hang on my wall, and they were spring, summer, fall, and winter, and I love those plates, and I gave them away to a granddaughter, and I think that was where the idea came from, because the winter couple were kind of plump and sitting in front of a fire and enjoying life, and it wasn't something I was looking for or seeking. I had been alone for a while, and my daughter lived with me, and I was very content. I'm 84 in a couple of weeks, and I grew up in the north end of Seattle. And what is interesting, I'm in a home right now, retirement home, about 5 blocks away from where I started out as a young married person. And I had 3 babies while I lived there in that house. I have 4. I was pregnant with the 4th when I left that house. I had them really close together, 4 children in 5 years. I usually tell anybody that's interested that I have ataxia. And in fact, I wrote a chapter about that. I called it My Unwanted Guest. And I first had signs of it coming when I was in my 60s. And it's only been in the last couple of years that I have had speaking problems. And I'm not embarrassed to say at all what I have. And that was part of my story in there, that I was reluctant to get married again to Larry because of my ataxia, because there's no cure for it and it's progressive. I did not want to be a burden. I was married young, and my husband's name was Dave. And We had a very long marriage. I think we were married 50-some years. And he had a stroke. And I was a full-time caregiver for about 5 years. And we always lived in the Seattle area. We did stained glass windows together. And he was pretty good at that, but colorblind. So I'd code everything. And then he'd make them, and several of the windows have been in homes. My grief process was different than a lot of people. I missed him, but I was relieved of 24-hour care. And all of a sudden, I just felt freedom. And I traveled, and I was a very content life. I never, ever thought about getting married or having a different relationship. No. I know that Larry and I never, ever in a wildest imagination thought we'd ever be together. And the way it happened was my husband died first, and then Denny, his wife, died a couple of years later. We were very good friends with Jenny and Larry, and there were a couple other couples, and we camped together a lot. And I had a habit of when a person lost their spouse, I met with them. And I asked my daughter, I said, would it be proper for me to invite Larry to lunch? And she said, well, certainly, Mom, you've known him for over 50 years. So that was, I invited him to have lunch, and I explained things that I had gone through. A few weeks later, I think it was, we got together and we had lunch again. It was just friends. Went to a couple of movies, found out we pretty well liked the same kind of movies and the same kind of music, and that's how it started. Well, yeah, my daughter picked up on that first, and she just talked about that Larry started bringing flowers when he came to visit. And after a couple of years of us going out, I could tell he was becoming more serious. And he talked about marriage, and I said, no, because of what I have. I didn't want to be a burden on anybody. And he keeps saying, you know, how much he loved me. I loved him too. But he'd say, but I know you're not going to marry me. And finally, it just hit me in the side of the head. I thought, you know, this guy really means it. He had said he didn't mind being married to me with something going on with me physically. And I said to him, you know, yes, I will marry you. And so he wanted to make sure he got a ring right away. And we went to the store, and at that time we hadn't told anybody in our family about it. And we picked out the ring, and I had kept my rings on my left side. So she just assumed that I was married, and it was a special occasion. And she said, is this a special occasion? We said, yeah, we've been married almost 60 years, but not to each other. And she didn't say a word. She just laughed a little bit. And then we had the fun of telling our family. And My daughter first noticed the ring on my hand, and she goes, "Is that what I think it means?" And I said, "Yes." And so she got on the phone and she started calling relatives, my grandchildren and my children. And she'd say, "Guess who's getting married?" And they'd guess everybody in the family is single. And then she'd say, "Grandma," and they go, "Grandma?" Well, we decided to only invite our family. And I was using a walker at the time. I said, there's no way I'm going to walk down the aisle with a walker. So I was sitting up front in a wheelchair, and Larry was sitting in a chair beside me. And there at the end of our ceremony, when he wanted to kiss me, he's standing behind the pastor with the funny grin on his face. It's in the picture. Well, we're coming up on our 8th anniversary in May. He is 88. I'm going to be 64 in a couple of weeks. 84, I mean, yeah.
Hi, I'm Larry. We kept our own name because Carol had been Carol Paige for 60 years. But we're still husband and wife. Thank you.
I think it's really important to have companionship. A lot of people don't need that. But for Larry and I, it's been absolutely wonderful. And we've both aged. He now uses a walker and I use a wheelchair. He uses my wheelchair like a walker. And with the different things that are going on in our bodies, it's just a companionship is best friends. We don't know how long we'll have each other, but what we have had has been wonderful companionship. Can I tell you a little tiny story about this Storyworth book? It was given to me for a Christmas present about 3 years ago with my Larry's daughter. And I said, I can't do this. I can't write. I can't type. And she goes, I think you can. And so with a lot of prayer, I had 2 granddaughters that were available just at that year, and I dictated the whole book, and they would enter the story as I dictated it, and I just feel the whole book was a miracle book. I did it in my 81st year, and all the things came back to my mind of my childhood. Yeah, it was just absolutely amazing.
That's it for this episode of the Storyworth Podcast. I'm Krista Baum. Thanks so much for listening. If you want to get started writing your own book of life stories, or want to give the gift of Storyworth to a loved one, head over to Storyworth.com. And if you want one of your stories to be considered for the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us at Storyworth.com/podcast. The Storyworth Podcast was produced by the folks at Good Weight Productions. Remember, everyone has a story worth sharing. See you soon.